Okay, so the story, one way to understand the story is that it's about two families, right? One family are the Finches. So we have Atticus, who's a lawyer, right? That's Scout and Jim's father. Then we have Jack, who is the brother of Atticus, and he's a doctor, right?
Yeah.
So in the Finch family, we're also including Calpurnia. Now, who is Calpurnia?
Calpurnia is there. It's like the housekeeper.
Yeah, like a maid. Now, the thing to keep in mind is that she is black, right?
Yes.
Okay, so now does Atticus treat Calpurnia any differently because she's black?
No.
No.
Atticus treat her like family.
That's correct. He treats her like a family member. Okay, good. So then the other family that we have to consider is we have to consider the Yules, right? So we have Robert Yule, who's the father. We have Burris Yule, who we meet in the first chapters of the books because, or the first couple of chapters of the book, because he is in the first grade with Scout. And then we have Mayella Yule, who is the sister of Burris, the daughter of Robert, and she is the one that accuses Tom Robinson, the black man, of attacking her, right?
Yeah.
Okay, now let's look at the differences between the two families, all right? So the Finches, one, they're educated. Atticus is a lawyer. His brother Jack is a doctor, right?
Yeah.
Scout can already read and write well beyond the others in the first grade, right? Okay, the Finches live in town next to the square, all right? The square is where all the government offices are. It's where the bank would be. It's where Atticus has his office, right? So it's the central part of town. Now, in the first couple of chapters of the book, we know that they live close to the square because Atticus walks home from his office for lunch, right? So that tells us a couple of things. Now, if you live next to the square, where all the government buildings are, like the court buildings and the banks and some of the major stores, do you think it's going to be expensive or cheap to live next to the square? Yeah, it's going to be expensive, right?
Yes.
So this tells us that the Finches had money, right? We also know they have money because they have a car and they have a maid, okay? Now, the thing to keep in mind that this is during the Great Depression, right?
Yes, the 30s.
That's right. So this emphasizes even more how much money the Finches have. They're wealthy, right? Okay, so the first thing is they're educated. Second thing is they're wealthy. And the third thing that is sort of covered throughout the book again and again is that the way the Finches resolve conflict, or the way that Atticus resolves conflict, is he uses reason. He uses his intelligence to resolve conflict, right? And this is something he's always telling his daughter to do. Use her reason and not violence. Don't resort to using her fists to resolve conflicts. This is going to be a very important theme in the book, and you're going to see why in a minute. All right, now let's compare this to the Yules. The Yules are the exact opposite of the Finches, okay? They are not educated. They only go to school one day out of the year. That's the first day of school, right? The rest of the school year they skip. They don't go to class, right? Second thing, geography in the book tells us something. Just like we understand by the fact that the Finches live next to the square, they must be wealthy because the square is the important part of the town. So if you're going to live next to the square, you must have money, right? Well, the opposite is true with the Yules. Where do the Yules live? Next to the city dump, right? Who wants to live next to the city dump? Nobody, right?
Mm-hmm.
So only the poorest of the poorest people who have no other possible place to live next to the city dump, right? Now, just as the Finches live next to the center of town, the Finches live the farthest away from town possible, because nobody in their right mind is going to put a city dump next to a town, right?
Mm-hmm.
They're going to put it far away from the town. So the geography of the book tells us something about the economic level of the people, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, third thing. Now, from the behavior of the Yules that we see with Burris in the first couple of chapters of the book, where he threatens the teacher, Miss Caroline, with physical violence, this is the opposite of the Finches. How do the Finches resolve conflict? How does Atticus resolve conflict? He uses his intelligence to resolve conflict. How does Burris and the Yules, how do they resolve conflict? Do they use intelligence or do they use violence? How do the Yules resolve conflict?
Violent.
Yeah, they use violence. This is the opposite of the Finches, right? Atticus is a lawyer. Atticus resolves conflict through reason, through intelligence, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, now let's look at the theme of racism. So we ask the question, which family is racist? The Finches or the Yules?
Yules.
Good. Now, for Harper Lee, there is a relationship between the characteristics of the Finches and the fact that they are not racist.
Mm-hmm.
There is a relationship between the characteristics of the Yules and the fact that they are racist. So, if we look at this, the characteristics of the Finches: educated, wealthy, they use reason to resolve conflict, right? The characteristics of the Yules: uneducated, poor, and violent, okay?
Mm-hmm.
So, based upon the differences, they're exact opposites, right? The Finches are the exact opposites of the Yules. The Yules are the exact opposite of the Finches, right?
Yeah.
So, you could draw the conclusion, and I think this is the conclusion that Harper Lee sort of is pointing the reader toward. You are more likely to be racist if you have the characteristics of the Yules, and less likely to be racist if you have the characteristics of the Finches. Now, this does not mean that if you're educated, wealthy, and you use reason to resolve conflict that you won't be racist. Okay, that doesn't mean that, and it doesn't mean that if you're uneducated and uneducated, poor, and have a tendency to use violence that you're a racist. It doesn't mean that. But the way she has set up the differences between the Finches and the Yules, according to her understanding, you're more likely to be racist if you're like the Yules. You are less likely to be racist if you're like the Finches, right?
Mm-hmm.
So this is important because the thing that if we see racism as a problem, what's the solution to racism? What's one possible solution to racism that Harper Lee presents in the book?
Equality.
What is, excuse me?
Equality?
Well, what is it that the Finches have that the Yules don't have that make a big difference on the other two characteristics? What is sort of like the first characteristic that influences the other characteristics? So think about it. Let's go back and look at it. So the Finches are educated. Atticus is a lawyer. His brother Jack is a doctor, right? As a result, they're wealthy, right?
Mm-hmm.
And third, Atticus uses reason to resolve conflict, and he encourages Scout, his daughter, to use reason to resolve conflict, right? Not violence. On the other hand, the Yules are uneducated. As a result of not having a great deal of education, they are poor.
So it's based on the education level.
Yeah, this is right. So I think this is the way that Harper Lee understands the problem. If you think about it, the way she presents it in the book, one important cause of racism is a lack of education, right?
Yes.
So the more educated you are, in other words, the more that you're like Atticus, someone who is educated, the less likely it will be that you will be racist, right?
Mm-hmm.
And if you are like the Yules and you lack education, then you are more likely to be racist, right? So the solution to the problem for Harper Lee is education, right? One way to get at this problem of racism that's presented in the book is to be educated, okay?
Mm-hmm.
You have to understand this because this is where it gets into what I think is the real problem of the book. See, the real problem isn't racism. That's the most obvious theme of the book, but it's not the real problem. You have to look at what causes the racism. And according to Harper Lee, what causes the racism? A lack of education, right? So the way you solve the problem of racism is through education. Now, this is where you get to the real problem of the book. The real problem of the book is about the nature of education, right? Okay, so let's look at, because see, for Harper Lee, if the problem is racism, well, how do you solve the problem of racism? Education. But then this gets us into a deeper problem. Is the education that she describes in the public schools, is it a good education or is it a bad education? What do you think? Who thinks the education in the school is good? Jeremy, what do you think? Do you think the education in the public school is good?
I don't think so.
All right, good. Why?
Because I think like the students they don't like the class at all, and I think like how to say I think the classes they're not like how to say like that meaningful. You know?
Okay, good. We'll get to it. All right, Leon, tell us, what do you think about Harper Lee's attitude toward public education? Do you think it's good or bad?
I think it was not too good.
Okay, let's look at a specific passage. Okay, remember, everything that I'm teaching you about the book comes from the book. All right, so let's look at this passage. So Miss Caroline began the day by reading us a story about cats. Okay, so the person narrating the passage is who? Who is narrating the passage?
Scott?
Who is telling? Yeah, Scout. Scout is telling us this information. Okay, so Miss Caroline began the day by reading us a story about cats. The cats had long conversations with one another. They wore cunning little clothes and lived in a warm house beneath the kitchen stove. By the time Miss Cat called the drugstore for an order of chocolate malted mice, the class was wriggling like a bucket full of catawba worms. Miss Caroline seemed unaware that the ragged, denim-shirted, and flour-sack-skirted first grade, most of whom had chopped cotton and fed hogs from the time they were able to walk, were immune to imaginative literature. Miss Caroline came to the end of the story and said, "Oh my, wasn't that nice?" All right. So, what's going on in this passage? Why is this passage important? Are the students paying attention to the teacher's story?
No.
No.
No. Okay. What tells us that they're not paying attention to the teacher's story? what in the passage tells us they're not paying attention?
I think it's because the Miss Curry say that, oh, my wasn't that nice. That means the students are not focusing on
No, look at this. Look at this. I'm going to highlight it for you right here. It's this thing right here. It's called a simile because she's using a like, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the class was wriggling like a bucket full of catawba worms. Okay, so catawba is just a kind of worm, right?
Mm-hmm. They're slappy.
So now, if you're sitting in your seat and you're wriggling around like a worm, are you paying attention to the teacher?
No, you're slappy and not like distracted by other things.
Yeah, you're distracted.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So the first thing to realize is that they're not paying attention. Okay, that's the first thing to realize. Now, the second question is to ask why. Why are they not engaged? Why are they distracted? Why are they bored?
Mm.
Does anybody know? Okay, let me help you out here. Let's look at the way that Harper Lee describes the students in the class. Okay, so let's see. I'm gonna highlight it for you right here. Okay, so the ragged. So if something is ragged, is it new or is it old? Harper, if something is ragged, is it new or is it old?
Ragged.
Yeah, is it new or is it old if it's ragged?
I think old.
Good, old. That's right. So are the students wearing new clothes or are they wearing old clothes?
Old clothes.
That's right, they're wearing old clothes. That's right, very good. Now, are the mice in the story rich or are they poor?
Poor.
The mice are poor?
No.
Mice are no.
Well,
Mice are no.
Let's look at how the mice are described. They're described as wearing cunning little clothes, and they live beneath a
Warm house.
kitchen stove, right?
Everyone's rich.
Yeah. Do the cats do physical work?
No.
No.
No, they sit around and have conversations all day long, right?
Shows the difference.
Yeah. Now, are the cats feeding hogs and are chopping cotton?
No.
No, the cats aren't doing what the children do, right? Yeah. The cats have nice clothes. The children don't have nice clothes. The cats are just sitting around having conversations. The children have to get up and chop cotton and feed hogs, right? And work, right? So can the children identify with what the life of the cat? Do they recognize that life?
No.
maybe no.
Yeah, who is the only student that possibly recognizes that kind of life? Who's the only student in the first grade that recognizes the life of the cat as her own kind of life? Well, what does Scout's dad do for a living? Leo, what does Scout's dad do for a living?
Scout do for a living?
Yeah, what does Scout's father do for a living? How does he make money?
A law.
He's a lawyer.
Lawyer.
Does he chop cotton and feed hogs?
No.
No. So the only student in the class that perhaps recognizes the cat's life as similar to her life is Scout. But do the rest of the students recognize the cat's life as their kind of life?
No.
That's right. So does that explain why they're wriggling in their seats like a bucket full of catawba worms?
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you understand how Harper Lee is criticizing public education, right? Is the teacher giving the students the kind of reading material that interests them?
No.
That's right. She's not giving the students the kind of literature that interests them, that they can identify with, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you can answer these questions, right? Are the students interested in the story? Well, they're wriggling like a bucket full of catawba worms, so that means no. And Harper Lee says they were immune to imaginative literature, so they're not interested, right?
Yes.
So why are the students not interested? Well, the cat story does not reflect the lives of most of the students, right?
Mm-hmm.
So then we get to this question. If the students are bored, can they be learning?
No.
That's right. That's right. So this is the first failure of public education. Now, again, this is a problem. Why? Because if racism is a problem and the solution is education, well, the education has got to work, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
But is public education working?
No. So the problem of discrimination is not solved.
That's right. Very good. That's exactly right. Good. I'm glad you see the connection. See? So for Harper Lee, if the problem is racism and the solution is education, well, the education system has got to work. But we see the education system not working. If the students are bored, they're not learning. If they're not learning, they're not getting educated. Right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Good. All right, now let's look at this next passage. Everything I'm showing you is from the book, okay?
Yeah.
So this is all Scout's experience of the first day of the first grade, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So describing Miss Caroline, Scout says, then she went to the blackboard and printed the alphabet in enormous square capitals, turned to the class and asked, does anybody know what these are? Everybody did. Most of the first grade had failed it last year. Okay, so Scout tells us most of the first grade failed the first grade the previous year.
Mm-hmm.
Does everybody understand that?
Yeah.
Okay, now the big question is, why did they fail the first grade? Why did they have to repeat the first grade?
Because they didn't finish what they should do. So they're
Okay.
again.
So Harper, you say it's because they didn't finish what they should do. In other words, they didn't finish their lessons, right?
Yes.
I think the teacher didn't teach them about.
Okay, so Leo, you think that the teacher didn't teach them well. Okay, Jeremy, what is your opinion? What reason do you think they might be failing the first grade?
I think it's both because they are not interested, and also the teacher is not actually teaching something useful.
Okay, so you think it might be a combination of what Harper and Leo told us, right?
Yes.
Okay, well let's look and see what the book says, because Harper Lee tells us. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
so the question is why? Why are they failing? Why did everybody fail the first grade except Scout? Remember, this is Scout's first day of the first grade, right? So I think it's in chapter 2. Walter Cunningham, who's a classmate of Scout's, comes home with Scout, right, to have lunch. So during the lunch, Atticus is there. He's walked home from his office, and Walter and Atticus are having a conversation, okay? And this is what Walter says to Atticus. He says, reason I can't pass the first grade, Mr. Finch, is I've had to stay out every spring and help Papa with the chopping. But there's another one at the house now that's field size. Okay, what does this passage mean? Does somebody want to tell me?
I think it's about he had to help his family.
Well, he'd rather do
Very
other
good,
things
Leo.
instead of study.
Okay, so let's take a look at it. So Walter is explaining to Atticus why he can't pass the first grade. He says, I can't pass the first grade, Mr. Finch, because I've had to stay out every spring and help Dad with the chopping of the cotton. Okay, so these are farm kids, right? The majority of people in Scout's class are farm kids. And what do farm kids have to do every spring? They have to bring in the harvest, right?
Yes.
So can you bring in the harvest and go to school at the same time?
No.
No.
No, right? Now, a majority of the students are farm kids, and every spring they have to miss school because they have to work. And this is what Walter explains to Mr. Finch. Then he goes on and he says, but there's another at the house now that's field size. In other words, there is a smaller brother who is now big enough to go out in the field and do the work, right? So now, because a smaller brother has gotten big enough so he can go out in the field and help Dad, Walter doesn't have to help Dad. Walter can go back to school, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So most of the students in the first grade are like Walter. They are farm kids. They come from the farm. They are poor. They have to miss school every spring because they are working on the farm. So most of the students have to miss school because they have to work. So they fail the first grade because they can't go to school. They are working on the farm. Is this fair to the students?
No.
No. Now think about this. If a majority of students are like Walter, then why doesn't the school change its hours during the spring so that the students can do the farm work and come to school later in the day? Right? But does it do that?
No.
No, it just fails those poor farm children, right? Okay, so now let's look at the failures of public schools so far. So the teacher uses material that bores the students, right? The teacher is telling them a story about rich cats with nice clothes who sit around and have conversations, okay? The majority of students are wearing worn out clothes. They're poor. They work, right? They can't identify with the lives of the cats, so they're not interested. They're bored. Second, the school schedule doesn't accommodate the needs of the majority of the students. Okay, so now this is important because if one of the causes of racism is being uneducated, but public education is really bad, then there is going to be a problem, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, so how does Miss Caroline treat the best student in the class? Who is the best student in the class?
Finch.
Scout, right?
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
That's right. Now, notice all of this about education is missing from the movie, right? None of this is in the movie. None of it. But this is really the whole point of the book, because according to Harper Lee, racism results from a lack of education. How do you solve the problem of education? Or how do you solve the problem of racism? Education. But if the education system is broken, how can you solve the problem of racism? You can't.
Yes.
So this is why it's very important to understand Harper Lee's criticism of public education. But it's not what they show in the movie, and it's not what they're going to teach you if you learn the book in school. Okay, so let's look at how Miss Caroline treats the best student in the class. Again, this comes from the book. So this is Scout. She discovered that I was literate and looked at me with more than faint distaste. Miss Caroline told me to tell my father not to teach me anymore. It would interfere with my reading. Okay, what's going on here? Does that make sense for a teacher to say that to the best student in the class?
No.
Why not? What does Atticus do for a living?
No.
He's a lawyer.
Yes.
So do you mean to tell me a lawyer is not qualified to teach his own daughter how to read?
Definitely not.
That's a stupid statement, right?
Yes.
Yes.
Is that statement meant to encourage Scout, or is it meant to discourage Scout?
Discourage Scout.
Yes, discourage Scout. Now, remember, we've all read Fahrenheit 451. Remember Fahrenheit 451?
Mm-hmm.
Remember, there's the conversation between Beatty and Montag. And Beatty says to Montag, the purpose of education is to make all the students the same, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Now, remember when we discussed Animal Farm, and we said, well, can the pigs and the sheep be the same?
No.
Can they be the same?
No.
No. So what Beatty says in Fahrenheit 451 is the purpose of public education is to make all the students alike. Is Scout like the other students?
No.
No.
You understand?
She is superior, right?
Yeah.
Does the teacher like that, or does she dislike it?
I dislike.
It's like
She dislikes the fact that Scout is better than the other students, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
So what does she do to Scout? She discourages Scout,
To
right?
study and teach by her father.
That's right. So clearly Atticus reading with his daughter only improves her reading ability, okay? So does Miss Caroline want Scout to be better than the other students? The answer is no. She doesn't want Scout to be excellent. She wants Scout to be mediocre, like the other students, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
See how this fits with what Beatty said to Montag?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Good. Okay. This is, there's a typo there. This is another problem, right? According to Harper Lee, this is another problem with public school, right? It encourages students to be average. It does not encourage students to be excellent.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, this is what Miss Caroline says to Scout. Now you tell your father not to teach you anymore. It's best to begin reading with a fresh mind. You tell him I'll take over from here and try to undo the damage. Now, are you telling me that Atticus has damaged his daughter by teaching her how to read and write?
No.
He's made her exceptional,
Yes.
right? But is that what Miss Caroline wants? Does Miss Caroline want Scout to be exceptional?
No.
No.
I want to be mediocre.
She wants Scout to be like all the other students, mediocre,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah.
Okay. Now, do you understand why they're not going to teach you this in school? Think about this. If you're sitting in a classroom and the teacher honestly teaches this book and the teacher says, well, you know, the purpose of school is to make you like all the other students, to make you equal, to make you equally mediocre. Does that sound like a school that you want to go to?
No.
Do you understand why teachers aren't going to teach you the book in a way that helps you understand the purpose of education?
Mm-hmm.
What's it say? This is Beatty. This is what Beatty says to Montag. We must all be alike. Not everyone born free and equal, as the Constitution says, but everyone made equal. Each man the image of every other. Then all are happy. For there are no mountains to make them cower, to judge themselves against. So, look, this is what Beatty is telling Montag. People are unhappy because there's inequality. In other words, mediocre people sit around and they see that other people are better than them. Does that make them happy? No, it makes them angry. It fills them with envy and hate, maybe self-hate. And then they project that hate onto people who are better than them. So how do you get rid of hate? Well, you make everybody the same. How do you make everybody the same? Public education.
Yes.
Do we see that this is what's happening to Scout? Is Miss Caroline encouraging Scout to be exceptional, or is she encouraging Scout to be mediocre?
Mediocre.
Right. So if you look at the quote and you look at the image, right? So there's the little boy as a log, or the little girl. He's pushed in the classroom, and the teacher makes them all the same, right?
Yeah.
That's what public education does. This is what Harper Lee wants you to understand. Public education makes you all the same. It makes you equally mediocre. So, so let's look at it. So public education harms the students. First, it bores the students. Second, it fails them if they have to work. Third, it does not encourage students to be exceptional. Rather, it encourages students to be mediocre. Okay? Now, a bad education system can only make the problem of racism worse, right? Because for Harper Lee, racism results from a lack of education. The solution to the problem of racism is education. But if the education system is bad, is the problem of racism going to get better, or is it going to get worse? That's right. It's going to get worse. So, what are the consequences of taking an exceptional student and putting her in a classroom of mediocre students? Okay. Well, let's see. So Harper Lee writes, this is Scout. I was bored, so I began to write a letter to Dill. Remember, that's her friend that she meets over the summer. Miss Caroline caught me writing, told me to tell my father to stop teaching me. Besides, she said, we don't write in the first grade, we print. You won't learn to write until you're in the third grade. Right? So, if you're bored, because she says, I was bored, if you're bored, can you learn? Are you learning?
No.
No. Okay, now, what happens to the exceptional student in the classroom of mediocre students where the teacher has low expectations and demands little from the students? Well, let's see what Harper Lee tells us. So, this is Scout. Remember, she's recounting her first day of the first grade. Miss Caroline picked up a ruler, gave me half a dozen quick little pats, then told me to stand in a corner. A storm of laughter broke loose when it finally occurred to the class that Miss Caroline had whipped me. So, this is important. How does Atticus resolve conflicts? Does he use violence or does he use reason?
Reason.
He uses reason. Now, Miss Caroline, the teacher, has a conflict with the student. Is she using reason or is she using violence?
Nonsense.
Yeah, she's using violence. She beats the student. She whips the student. She whips the exceptional student in front of the other students. So do you think that's going to send a positive message to the students or a negative message?
Negative.
Yes, negative. Okay? So, Miss Caroline physically punishes the exceptional student. What message does that send to the other students?
Mentally.
It's better to be mediocre and not exceptional like Scout, because if you are exceptional, you get singled out for punishment. Miss Caroline uses physical violence against the student. One of the students copies Miss Caroline. right?
Yeah.
So this is where we get to Burris Yule, okay? Now remember, the Yules are racist.
Mm-hmm.
So Harper Lee writes, Miss Caroline, she's talking to Burris. Miss Caroline said, "Sit back down, please, Burris." And the moment she said it, I knew she had made a serious mistake. The boy's condescension flashed anger. "You try and make me, missus." So Burris is copying the behavior that he has seen Miss Caroline use. Miss Caroline uses violence against a student that she has a conflict with, and Burris simply imitates that behavior. He threatens physical violence as a way of resolving conflict with the teacher. Is that what schools should be teaching their students?
No.
No. Schools should be teaching students how to resolve conflict through the use of intelligence, through the use of reason, not through the use of violence. Right?
Mm-hmm.
So do you think Miss Caroline is setting a good example or a bad example?
Bad example.
Yes, very good. So Burris threatens Miss Caroline with physical violence. Burris only copies Miss Caroline's behavior.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah.
Now let's contrast this. Let's contrast this with the way that Atticus deals with his daughter. Okay. So this is Harper Lee. She writes, "When Atticus looked down at me, I saw the expression on his face that always made me expect something. 'Do you know what a compromise is?' he asked. 'Bending the law?' 'No, an agreement reached by mutual concessions. It works this way,' he said. 'If you'll concede the necessity of going to school, we'll go on reading every night, just as we always have. Is it a bargain?' 'Yes, sir.'" So, is Atticus using violence to resolve this conflict that he has with his daughter? Does he threaten her with physical violence?
No.
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 He uses reason,
Reasons.
right?
But because he's well educated.
That's right. He's using reason, but he's also teaching his daughter an important lesson. The important lesson is use reason, use intelligence to resolve conflict, not physical violence, right? Now, certainly school is where you should learn that lesson, right?
But the school are not teaching this lesson.
That's right. But the public school, let's make sure and make a distinction, because certainly Harper Lee makes this distinction, and we're going to cover it.
Mm-hmm.
There is a difference between public school and private school, right?
Yeah.
Or home school. So public school is failing because it doesn't teach this important lesson. The important lesson is that you resolve conflict through the use of intelligence and reason, not violence, right?
Yeah.
See, now this is a lesson that Atticus repeats later on in the book when he has to take the case of Tom Robinson, the black man falsely accused of raping Mayella. He says to Scout, "You might hear some ugly talk about it at school." In other words, the ugly talk that he's having to defend a black man against this accusation of rape by a white woman.
Mm-hmm.
"But do one thing for me, if you will. You just hold your head high and keep those fists down. No matter what anybody says, don't let them get your goat." Now, get your goat here means don't let them make you angry, right?
Mm-hmm.
"Try fighting with your head for a change. It's a good one, even if it does resist learning." So he's encouraging Scout to resolve conflict through reason, not violence, right?
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
He encourages her not to use violence when dealing with others. He's consistent. He doesn't use violence, and he doesn't want his daughter to use violence. Now, if public school is so bad, what's the alternative? Is there an alternative?
No.
Well, I think there is. Okay, this is Harper Lee, and she's talking to her dad because after her first day of school, she doesn't want to go back, right? She hasn't had a good experience in the first day of school. So she says to her dad, you never went to school. In other words, you never went to public school, and you do all right.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll just stay home too. You can teach me like Granddaddy taught you and Uncle Jack. Okay, so now where did Atticus and his brother, Uncle Jack, who is a doctor, were they taught in public school? No. Where did they get their education? At home. They were taught at home, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's what we would call private school, right?
Yes.
So how do we know that the quality of education at home, in other words, private school, is better than public education, the public education that Scout is receiving? Well, Atticus is a lawyer, right? His brother is a doctor. These are professions that require exceptional students. You can't be a dummy and be a lawyer. You can't be stupid and be a doctor, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Did they get this Did they get this education at public school?
No.
No, they got it at home, private school, right?
Yeah.
So Harper Lee continues. She says, Atticus and my uncle, who went to school at home, knew everything. At least what one didn't know, the other did, right?
Yeah.
So now let's contrast this with the poor students in the first grade who have to repeat the alphabet. Why? Because they failed the first grade the previous year. Are they being encouraged to be exceptional?
No.
Does public school encourage the students to be exceptional?
Yes.
No.
Oh, no. I mean,
Yeah, you mean no, right? Public school does not encourage the students to be exceptional, right?
but private school is different.
Yes, but private school is different. So unlike public school, private education encourages students to be exceptional. Atticus is a smart man, and he knows the difference between public and private school.
Mm-hmm.
So then why does he send his own daughter to public school?
Mm.
Well, let's look at what the text says, okay? So Harper Lee writes, you never went to school and you do all right, so I'll stay home too. You can teach me like Granddaddy taught you and Uncle Jack.
Yeah.
No, I can't, said Atticus. I have to make a living. Besides, they'd put me in jail if I kept you at home, right?
Yes.
So the government is going to put Atticus in jail if he keeps his own daughter at home so that he can educate her. Atticus is forced by the threat of violence to send his own daughter to public school.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, now let's look at what Scout says about her experience. So describing her experience at school, Scout states, as I inched sluggishly along the treadmill of Macomb County school system, I could not help receiving the impression that I was being cheated out of something. Out of what? I knew not. Yet I did not believe that 12 years of unrelieved boredom was exactly what the state had in mind for me. Well, what do you think about that? Do you think that's true? Do you think that's not true? See this triangle here down on the right side?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
All right. Now, see the base is at the bottom, right?
Yeah.
Now, let's imagine that we turn that triangle upside down. Do you think that would be stable if we turn that triangle upside down?
No.
No. So the question is, if society is stable, where it's a triangle and a majority of people are at the bottom and only a small minority of people are at the top, how do we make it so that a majority of people are at the bottom of the triangle? What is the tool that the government could use? Government anywhere. like in the United States. What is a tool that the government could use to make sure that a majority of people are at the bottom of the triangle?
Public education.
That's right. Does everybody get to go to Harvard?
No.
Does everybody get to go to boarding schools like Choate and Taft?
No.
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 So you see that there is a difference between public education and private education. Now, this is not what Harper Lee is saying. Harper Lee is not saying that public education is a tool to make a majority of people mediocre so that they're at the bottom of the triangle. And private education is a way for only a minority of people to rule over a majority of people. She's not saying that. But if you look at the book, it's pretty clear that that's what's happening, right?
Mm-hmm.
Did Atticus go to public school? No. Is Atticus exceptional? Yes. Are the majority of students in public school like Scout? No. So, if you want to make a stable society, and a stable society looks like a triangle where a majority of people are at the bottom, only a small minority are at the top, what's a good way that you could make that happen if you were a government? What tool would you use to make it happen so that a majority of people were mediocre?
Public education.
That's right. Now, do you see why they're not going to teach you that in school? For Harper Lee, education is important because it's the only way that you can sort of save civilization, right? If racism is caused by a lack of education, then you have to have a good education system. But if the education system is broken, are you going to solve the problem of racism?
No.
No.
Okay. And if the education system is broken, are you going to solve the problem of violence?
No.
No.